We have a sort of hybrid academic and discussion section today. We have a couple of papers that we'll start with, two presentations from Olaf Corry and Jeroen Oomen. And then we have a sort of a discussion and reaction to those from Hin-Yan Liu and Rose Matiso. And so it'll be sort of a hybrid discussion, leave some time in the end for audience questions, participation, debates, things like that. I just wanted to say a few words up front about just the title of the session, Ungovernability and Security Risks, to put just a little bit of contextualization on some of these questions. I should also introduce myself. The picture's a little bit old. It's post-2020, but I'm much more gray now. I'm Jessica Seddon. I spent part of my life in a policy school, social scientist by training, and then I spent part of my life in a sort of think tank consultancy. I hate the word think and do tank that works on institutional design. So I'm essentially always looking at this question of the design of governance and what might be effective. And I wanted to highlight in the title this point about ungovernability, because the discussion here and a lot of the kind of propositions about potential ways to structure the steering of this group of ideas is, this SRM is and will be governed somehow. The question is really, and in some ways, if you take the definition of governance that comes from Oren Young, this idea that governance is the set of social structures for steering toward collectively preferable outcomes and away from undesirable. Those social structures are all around us, whether we consciously, deliberately create them or not. And to ignore the fact of the ones that are there is, I think, a mistake. And so in some ways, this brings us back to the stakes of these kinds of discussions and these kinds of propositions and observations, is how can these social structures be collectively more deliberate and effective in steering toward preferable outcomes and away from undesirable. So I just wanted to lay that as a little bit of background for how to think about these questions, that there is, the default is not the absence. The default is something. And it is, I think, up to many of us in a much larger community to be deliberate about what is the alternative to the default that exists now. So I won't take up any more time with kind of cryptic high-level observations, but I'll turn it over to Olaf to start off with here. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Cryptic high-level observations is my thing, so. I think actually I would maybe, that's an interesting point, whether the de facto is towards, yes, there are structures, that's de facto, that govern the way that we interact, but whether they are necessarily de facto oriented towards collective and desirable outcomes, I wouldn't agree. How do I play on this? This one? Here we go. So don't put too much into the title. I just thought of that some dark night before I sent the abstract. So, but maybe it's what I meant with the comment that I just made, that there are structures there. I don't think we can assume that these are collective in any way and necessarily, and not necessarily taking us towards anything desirable. But although it could happen. So the basic problem that I work with is with climate as a planetary singular system, and coming at it from an international relations background. My ontology from international relations is precisely the fragmentation of the world into multiple coexisting societal units. And through history, those units have looked very different. At the moment, many of them are states, not all of them. And some are empires, some are nations without states, etc. And this sort of point of tension is what I'm working with. And with geoengineering, because so much of the knowledge production which performs SRM as a thing, which doesn't yet really exist in a physical sense, is produced through models that treat the world as a singular place. And treat it as such for obvious reasons, because the climate is an integrated system, and that's how it should be. But it's also reflected in many of the metaphors and symbols that are used for geoengineering. There's almost a built-in assumption of a single planner, whether that is an actual single world planner in a single person, or whether it's one hegemonic state, or whether it's a coalition of powerful states, or whether it's some kind of monetary policy committee kind of expert scientist mandated by an international agreement, or whatever it is. Many times it's assumed in the work that is done exploring the geophysical implications of climate interventions that this is somehow in place. And I worry sometimes that this leads us to an overly optimistic version of the conclusion on the plausibility of some of the things that we do. The other metaphor of the cancer patient and the doctor, so there's a singular doctor treating a singular patient. These things come up in all kinds of ways. The napkin diagram, which is in principle thinking about a global set of policy, portfolio of policies headed towards a singular global goal and operate it, and that the idea that SRM would then rationally be inserted even in relation to a whole lot of other policy options also rationally deployed for a temporary peak shaving experience, etc. And sometimes it's explicit in the modeling, and sometimes it's not explicit. Sometimes it's not assumed, and there is modeling of conflictual, but the non-ideal scenarios are much less common. And in relation to that, we have this world here color-coded according to different empires as well, just to stress that there's also a tendency when the international is introduced into the debate that we assume a world of sovereign equal states, each with a rational climate preference, for example, or willingness to cooperate. So this is a world of, I think, multiple uneven societies with uneven relationships between them, which I think is fundamental to understanding what kind of a technology SRM really can be, because it will be part of a world which is structured in this way. So what am I doing to solve this problem, or tackle it at least? I ran a project with colleagues Duncan McLaren and Nilay Kornbeck called iSpace, International Security Politics and Climate Engineering, trying to grab some Apple vibe there with the small I, at the University of Copenhagen, my previous position. And what we wanted to do was, instead of starting with the science, as it's often called, and then we add some governance questions and considerations, we wanted to start instead from a group of practitioners who are not trained to think about the climate, not trained to want to optimize global climate risk mitigation, but trained to think and act in a community of practice that is oriented towards security concerns. And in doing that, we sort of went to the hardest version of security. I don't believe that's the only meaning of the concept of security, but we went to the military planners, the think tanks, some diplomats as well, and we used the Arctic as a sort of methodological tool because it's often envisioned, the previous panel I was at, envisioned it as well in one of the posters, that the Arctic is a place of potential climate intervention. And so we took the 5 literal climate states, Canada, the US, Denmark, Norway, and Russia, although we had to use Russian experts and not Russians in the end for that country. So there were some methodological challenges, but what we basically did was to explore how they ascribe meaning to, firstly, climate security, notions of security for them, how they view the nexus between climate and security, so getting a conceptual context for how they would react to SRM, and then simply to make sure that we started on a common basis, we gave them the definition from the NAS report reflecting sunlight, so that we were on an even sort of starting ground. This is a sort of blah blah technology kind of, this is the idea. And then modeling research suggests that such interventions could be effective at lowering global temperatures, but with diverse regional effects, etc. And the practical, social, political challenges involved are not well explored. So that kind of teed us up. And we also did some workshops with the Ministry of Defence in Britain, actually, and we spoke to some NATO experts as well. So we went slightly outside of the Arctic framing that we originally started with. So I'm going to just present you some key findings. Oh, I didn't mention, it's obviously not very well-known technology. So it was very, very hard to find people who knew a lot about this in the security sector, and if they did know a lot about it, they probably didn't want to talk to us. So we had to construct a kind of translation zone between climate science knowledge and security knowledge and expertise. And obviously we are the curators of that situation, but this is what basically came out of it, and we can help each other interpret it afterwards. So first off was to sort of put some flesh on the bones. What is security for you? Because every country and every community has different ideas about what this special category that warrants emergency measures, exceptional measures. When is the state of exception invoked? What kind of things and threats do we think about? And for just three of them, the US was looking at, for them, maintaining military dominance and geopolitical hegemony was basically the headline. So for them, security doesn't just mean nobody encroaches on our borders. It's a particular notion of security which reflects the geopolitical position that the US has and the historical ideas that it's developed about itself and its relationship to the world. And to avoid even the emergence of hegemonic power in other parts of the world. So there was a sort of relational peer rivalry dimension there. Something that was mirrored in the Russian response, proxy response, defending national sovereignty. It was bound up with sustained rivalry with the West. We've found that relatively often that it was actually directed towards another state. So it was, yeah.
Sorry, when did you do this?
And so it started in 2019 and we ran through to about 2023. So the Ukraine war broke out in the middle of it as well, or the second phase of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Then less powerful states such as Denmark had a much more sort of maintaining independence, integrity of the sovereign polity. I guess today Denmark would probably think about territorial sovereignty in a new way, economic and community security. And then we know from other work, although we didn't engage with Arctic indigenous people, that notions of indigenous sovereignty tend to be quite different. Again, it's about a sort of intimate cultural and political integrity in relation to land, specifically. So the headline sort of thing that came out of it and went into the abstract of this paper, which came out in Review of International Studies, is that if we start from the other side, instead of starting from the climate science paradigm, we basically get three major shifts in what SRM appears to be about, if you like. So it goes from being a climate global public good, so in the napkin diagram we have it assumed to be a global public good, to basically to being a source of geopolitical leverage and disruption. That's of course their angle, that's what they do, this is what they see. But this is nevertheless an important constituency in the world, and maybe particularly important for technologies like SAI, which was actually, didn't mention, but that's the kind of SRM that we focused on. We did mention some of the others. But secondly, it goes from being basically seen as a risk reduction tool, driven by, we consider countries will want this if there's a heat wave, it will be climate driven, it will be climate related, climate risk driven, to being seen by them as a really worrisome source of instability and potential escalation. So in a way, it was the mirror opposite starting point on that point. And thirdly, knowledge about this and the research they saw as not necessarily something where more is better, and the more we know, the less uncertainty, the less risk we will face. But contrary to that, it was a potential, so it's seen as a sort of potential, these guys inventing this are creating a vector for potential disinformation that we might have to manage, and as a sort of source of distrust as well as knowledge. Now, they didn't oppose research, which I'll get to in a minute. But if we want to drill down a little bit more into what they were talking about, they saw pathways to unilateral use most likely followed by competing and uncoordinated deployment. So they and potentially counter geoengineering. So rather than assuming a sort of global benevolent planner, they assumed this would be a sort of multiple and distributed form of activity. It would have, quote, implications for geostrategic balance, so although it wasn't directly weaponizable, they couldn't see any way of blowing up somebody's bridge with it, for example. It wouldn't be a kinetic weapon in that sense. It was definitely interpreted to have obvious geostrategic balance. And the military they all expected that they would be called upon to potentially deliver. As an example, space-based solar, space mirrors and moon dust ideas came up. And one respondent said, nobody can do anything in space without their consent, meaning the ones who have potentially built an industrial plant on the moon to spray dust up into the Lagrange point or something. And by extension, nobody can do anything of substance on the world's oceans without their consent. So if you have space dominance, this is a highly strategic site of intervention. And if geoengineering involves that zone, and possibly other zones, but this is one example. Some were then recalling ideas of weather warfare. This was sort of free association, and expecting there to be diplomatic responses, maybe cyber responses, and hybrid warfare was a kind of metaphor or sort of language that they used to understand what the conflict might look like. So not necessarily hot military conflict, which we tend to gravitate towards when we think about security and SRM. Distrust in information. So why did they think that? This is a quote. Disinformation is a huge challenge here, playing into great power competition. So they start from the starting point of existing geopolitical distrust and competition, and then they read the technology as entering into that space. It's not rocket science, although, yeah, no pun intended. Unless geoengineering can be easily explained, visualized, and tracked, it will be liable to deliberate misinformation. So they could see some ways of maybe overcoming this kind of mistrust, but it would require a lot of infrastructure and institutions to share information. The attribution question came up. I'll speed up a bit because I think I'm running out of time. Who had caused what? This is something we also discuss a lot in this community, I think, in my experience. If there is a weather event, and they've pointed even to the Russian accusations in 2010 that forest fires had been caused by the Americans. Some forest fires around, I think it was around Moscow or St. Petersburg, I can't remember actually. So they see examples of propaganda and imagine that this could be used. And they were much more concerned about the other guys having it, which is no surprise either. So they assumed that we were talking about if they had it. And then at some point we introduced, what if it's the others that had it, so if the potential adversaries. And there it was like, oh, that's a no-no. I mean, we would not want that to happen. And even experiments would raise a red flag. One responded, he said, if it involved putting things in the atmosphere or global commons, which I guess is what we've kind of got on the table here. And then there was this idea of uncertainty because they know climate outcomes are probabilistic and not deterministic. This idea that it would be, if somebody said, well, we're doing it for the global good, they would be suspicious of that. So what about governance? We asked them, how would you imagine or what would you want to see? They all thought this was pretty unlikely. And this is interesting, I think, because governance has become a sort of mantra in this field. Every time somebody researches it, the Royal Society report, obviously we wouldn't do this without adequate international governance, and this G word is kind of sprayed around liberally. But they were very skeptical, and the way that they imagined governance in a sort of in the sense that Jessica described here, was mainly in terms of checks and balances, arms races, or mutual deterrence, and they were skeptical about multilateral global governance. They didn't rule it out. If we jump down to the last bullet point here, the routes to coordinated deployment they saw, but they thought it had to start early before deployment, long before deployment. So there had to be a sort of joint research program or some kind of interaction and openness that could potentially a narrow route via mini, first, or bilateral origins to a UN-endorsed treaty. These are also ideas that are bandied around in these. And then the research governance, just to unfold that as the last thing, they were pretty clear that, I guess they know from military technologies, that once these things are being invented, it's very difficult to put them back in the box. And they did think, research is definitely necessary, but, and this is from the same respondee, we need to regulate the research because it's the research that generates the capacity. So they saw research as capacity building up to a capability which had potential strategic importance. Research and experimentation was preferable in the international multilateral context. That was a Russian view. And should be mandated and financed, etc., monitored within legitimate organizations if possible. And that would have to happen before one country invests heavily. And so, as a sort of summary, if we go from the climate community to the security community, we have a difference in assumed purpose or central purpose. The rationality to acquire it is assumed usually in all our literature almost. In fact, it's built into the definition from the Royal Society that this is specifically a technology for dealing with global warming. For them, that was an open question. It could also be, we need to get it simply because others have it. And I know there's some wargaming that has led some countries to think in those terms, that not necessarily from we're going to overshoot our climate goals, but we need to not lose control of this in a sort of geopolitical logic. Different metaphors, different ways of interpreting the advantage that it's high leverage, different kinds of temporalities from decades, maybe centuries in climate model scenarios to much shorter term considerations that is usual for the security community. And as something that informs policymakers, this was also something the knowledge about it could also prompt certain kinds of disinformation. Main difference in the sort of emphasis on what kind of governance they expected or could imagine would work. And finally, the global good versus the geopolitical disruptor. So that's what I have to say. And these are some of the publications that came out of the project and a couple of others from other authors.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so following on from Olaf, I will speak a little bit about one of the chapters in a current book project that has just come out, where we really try to analyze that question that Jessica basically put on the table, that the default of governance is not the absence. It's never the absence, because there are always implicit systems of governing in our societies, right? So our major question was, how does that work in environmental politics? And so the observation that we make very centrally is that environmental politics, as it has been constructed over the past half century, will not deliver, and it cannot deliver. And that there is an increasing realization within environmental politics itself that it won't deliver. And the key sort of claim there that we make is that is because we organize out all kinds of cultural concerns and cultural drivers of unsustainability that we don't let into our politics and our sustainability questions. That's not, though, what I want to talk about today. I just wanted to give you a little bit of that background. What I want to talk about is how this features into what I see as a sort of production of an inevitability of SRM. And not to say that SRM is inevitable, but that there are all kinds of implicit governance forces in play that will render it inevitable if we don't treat them very carefully. So I will talk you through a couple of those examples, and I'm happy to chat more, and I'm also sure that a lot of you will disagree with a lot of what I'm going to have to say. That's usually the way it goes when I come into the SRM space. For the people who know me, I'm very happy to disagree with you, right? But I do think it's important to recognize that within sort of the regime of environmental politics, there is an increasing recognition of its failure. And I don't mean to say this in that I actually quite agree with what David Keith said this morning, that if you look at this at very long timescales, potentially we are on a somewhat of a right track in terms of emissions and climate targets. But we aren't on the right track if you take it within the way that climate politics has defined its aims, specifically the 1.5 and the 2-degree targets. And this will be very important later in the talk. We are also very much not on the right track if we take environmental politics as a broader spectrum than just climate targets. Right? If you're taking resource use and biodiversity loss into account, we have a massive problem that is not just able to be addressed by using these isolated technologies. That's the claim. But you can see all these actors in sort of the centers of power, right, or at least of epistemic power, like power, knowledge power, saying that basically it is a fantasy, talking about carbon capture. That's Fatih Birol who says it about, who's the head of the International Energy Agency. Bart van der Hurk, the new co-chair, vice chair of the IPCC, says 1.5 degrees is a fairy tale. Right? So basically, people have given up to some extent on that notion of climate politics. Oh, I went all the way. I don't know what happened now. Going all the way back. And our claim is that failure, and you don't necessarily need to read all of this, but it's really about that second part of the first sentence. Environmental politics is culturally and materially unable to imagine futures that are meaningfully different from the present. All we do is create knowledge systems that create the assumption that tomorrow can be quite similar to today. The things that we allow to change in our mental images and in our governance images are typically technological changes. They aren't cultural changes, and they're usually not socioeconomic changes or geopolitical changes. But getting back to that point that Jessica made, that the default of governance is not absence, it is not an inability. It is the consequence of a very particular way of building knowledge and a very particular way of doing politics. And that's where SRM, to me, comes in. And so what we analyze in the book is what we call a dramaturgical regime, right? A routinized set of performances and conventions through which politics are enacted. So this is a much broader understanding of politics than something that is about rules and regulations per se. It's about all the ways that we implicitly govern ourselves and each other to behave in a certain way. And this includes certain ways of doing science. This includes certain ways of talking about what is at stake. Now, in that dramaturgical regime, we give a very particular role to science. Science is supposed to be policy-oriented. Moreover, it is not just policy-oriented. It is geared at that single image of a homogeneous climate that Olaf was also talking about just now, right? We are building a science as if we have a global governance system with a cockpit that can decide. We've also institutionalized that, right? That we have the COPs to give that suggestion. So in that space, and I'm going to rush through a couple of these things to open up some of the arguments, I think there are several things that are really important that allow for the production of the inevitability of SRM, and the things that we should think about very seriously. And I have a very simple sort of outline in this peace in ethics and international affairs. But I think there are three things that I want to talk about today. So first, it is how we depoliticize issues through scientific authority. I'll give an example of that. Two, it is producing inevitability through what Keller Easterling calls extra statecraft, moments of governing that happen beyond the actual official governing bodies that still have huge effect on the way that we actually go about through the world. Normalization through political calibration, and I'll explain that in a second. And the one thing that I've been starting to really think about recently, but I don't really have that much on yet, is this commercialization that also works to normalize this idea. So in geoengineering, or in SRM, there's this normal observation that I mostly share, that there used to be a taboo on SRM research, right? And this is, I guess, the quintessential graph to show that this was broken at some point. Now, I think one of the things that we've gotten stuck in is talking about it as if we're in that taboo space, where we're fighting against a larger, bigger, bad outside world that doesn't want to talk about this. But there are actually many drivers within that larger, big, bad outside world that work quite deliberately to push this back in. One, and I'm drawing a lot on work of people who aren't present here, like Arti Gupta and Ina Müller, Sean Lowe, Olaf is here. One is that we depoliticize issues through scientific authority. And there's a fantastic article by Arti Gupta and Ina Müller on this, how through scientific expertise, you can erase certain questions from entering into the political space. And they call that de facto governance. So it's not officially something that is governing, but it steers our direction and our attention in a particular way. And so they give this example first of the Royal Society report and then the NAS double report on climate intervention. That what they did was they defined in 2 steps the global climate as an issue as a system with 2 levers that you can pull. Right? So it's a 2-dimensional thing. You can either pull on CO2 or you do radiative forcing. Now, by couching it in those terms, what happened over the years was that people started to go along with that framing. And what fell out was all kinds of questions about what they call first-order questions of desirability. So we use geotechnical framings or geophysical framings to then talk about the scientific part, but as a consequence, often political questions fall out. And I think most of the people in this room are aware of those political questions, but that's not the way how it translates into a wider culture, right? So I don't want this to be mistaken to say, well, we are all doing it wrong. I think what we are misunderstanding is that this isn't just something that happens here. It is something that has to be translated into a wider culture. And that in that wider culture, spectacle and sort of attention grabbing and framing has a huge influence. Now the second thing, and this is where I always bring up the analogy with CDR, is normalization through political calibration. Right? When I came into the geoengineering space, that was 2015, everyone around me, also in the CDR community itself, talked about it as a very invasive, speculative, and uncertain way of dealing with the climate change issue. By the time I finished my PhD, 3.5 years later, it was established as a key part of climate policy. Not explicitly, but everyone was assuming it would. And net zero had become the new tagline. Now, clearly, for me as someone who is fascinated by that kind of question, the question became, okay, so how did that happen? The key graph to understand how that happened is this. And I think a lot of you might know this story, but I think it bears repeating. That in 2015, the IPCC published its 1.5-degree target report. And the report basically said, the integrated assessment models, the integrated assessment models in the report basically said, you cannot get to 1.5-degree target without CDR. It cannot be done. Now, there are really important caveats to understand what happened there. The first is, with this community, when they were basically asked in 2015 to answer the question, can this be done, couldn't say, no, this can't be done. At the moment they would give all kinds of scenarios to show that 1.5 couldn't be done within normal assumptions, 1.5 would have been dead. So it would have been the killing blow for environmental politics or for climate politics. They would never have done that. So we started interviewing them, and they came up with things like, I'm not sure we can reach it, but we can always model it. We can surely solve it in the models. The second thing is that to get their work to be accepted as policy relevant, but not to be accused of taking the role of the policymakers, there were all kinds of assumptions that they they had to make in their assumptions. One is that even the rich countries always in all these scenarios will have a 1 to 2% GDP growth, which in practice means that they will have more material growth than global south countries, just not in relative terms. They had to do that because otherwise they wouldn't even get through peer review, let alone be taken seriously as a policy option. They had a discount rate in there, they had linear technological progress in there, assuming that this kind of technology, carbon capture technology, would get linearly cheaper into the future. Now, all of those assumptions, right, they're in there for good reasons. They're policed by the community itself for good reasons. We can debate about that. I'm very skeptical about it. The issue is that once it is in a graph like this, no one cares. No one knows. We worked with them for 6 years with these integrated assessment modelers. We only learned after 4 that there were no things like infrastructure write-offs in the models, right? So if you built a coal plant in these models in 2015, it would run until 2055 because it was assumed that policymakers and politicians would never go along with saying, well, we'll just close it because we want to. Because it's not an economically optimal decision-making process. All these assumptions are packed into this, and we just don't know. Like, no one knows. Not even the people running the models know exactly what is in there because it's just such a big team. So then you normalize something, and it can happen really rapidly. My fear is that with SRM, we're now at the sort of same, at the 2015 moment for CDR. No one had a real democratic and governance debate about, do we want this? It just happened, right? And then you get people like Vicky Holub, the CEO of Occidental Oil, who say, well, I don't want to see the end of fossil fuels because direct air capture is going to be the technology that helps preserve our industry over time. This gives our industry a license to continue to operate for 60, 70, 80 years. These cultural dynamics will also play here. There are ways that people will use it to scare people, like we talked about this morning. I think it was mentioned that now 30 states, roughly in the US, are banning or trying to ban SRM because they're scared of its connection to chemtrails. But it will also be used discursively in this way, and we can't really tell how that works out. Now, I think the one that I'm most afraid of is the governance mechanisms that we don't control, and that it's very opaque who does control them. And this is, I'm drawing all of this from conversation with Ina Müller, who looked into this. So in 2019, there was a leak from the International Standards Organization. And the International Standards Organization it is hard to overstate how influential the International Standards Organization is, right? They standardize everything. Everything that you're using in the room right now is in some way, shape, or form standardized by the International Standards Organization. The thickness of your credit card, what a USB-C is, what a good charger is, what certain technical things about how your phone works, all of it standardized by the ISO. But importantly, they are also increasingly trying to standardize governance mechanisms and management standards. And one of the things that they wanted to standardize was a radiative forcing standard instead of a CO2 equivalence forcing. Now that is profoundly scary, right? I think a lot of people in this room will immediately know what that means, but to spell it out, the claim was that radiative forcing is a much better metric to use to understand our impact, global impact or company impact on the climate, because it measures both the ways that we have positive forcing and the way that we have negative forcing, both the ways that we're cooling and the ways that we're warming. Now the implication, so you can make an argument for this, but the implication is very simple, right? If this comes in, you can have companies who are going to tell you that they are climate neutral because they're offsetting their CO2 emissions with either pollution or with SRM. And so everyone knows that it's never going to be allowed to do it with pollution. So people were very worried that it was just a way to sort of push in SRM. It was leaked. There was an uproar. It didn't happen. It wasn't a standard. It became a guidance, so it wasn't binding. But it's really, there is no way to overstate how profoundly influential this had been. It is opaque. No one knows who's in the room. You can't get access to the room unless you're accredited. And the only reason we knew was because people leaked, and it's probably one of the European countries who was really angry about it. Right? So this is the extra statecraft that I was talking about. So where does SRM proliferate in ways that we don't really understand? And then finally, I think one of these spaces is the commercialization space, but I haven't really talked this through so much. So this is from the Make Sunset folks. I hear you already had a good laugh about them yesterday, so I won't go into that. But I think that's really what we ought to be worried about a lot. So I think when you take this space as a whole, we need to take very seriously that there is a sort of funnel within environmental politics, within the larger cultural politics of it, that pushes into view technological solutions much more readily than expensive things or invasive things like mitigation, and let alone justice concerns, right? Let alone these concerns of maybe we need to have global redistribution measures. And so this is why I would say that the force, like the political force that is most influential right now, is towards pushing this as a normal option of mitigation. And I can't tell you if you want that or not. I mean, clearly I don't want that, and that's my position. But you cannot be naive of it. You have to be honest about it, that is at play. That's all I want for this community to have a serious conversation about. And then maybe I will be less pessimistic, less antagonistic. You came in just at the right time. Then I will be nicer to you. All right, thank you.
So 2 provocations to think of other perspectives and not be naive about them. At this point, we're going to shift gears into more of a discussion. So what I'd like to do is call Rose and Hin-Yan and also Jeroen and Olaf up to the front, and I'm going to switch this out, and we'll move into discussion format. A few minutes, have room for questions at the end. Go. Great. Let's see if I can. I'm attempting to do that as well as extricate the microphone. But I only have 2 hands. There we go. Okay. Names. So Hin-Yan, would you like? So Hin-Yan and Rose basically have sort of the first crack at discussions and observations on these 2 provocations. And so I'll start with giving both of them a little bit of floor space to do that. Turn to Olaf and Jeroen to respond, maybe intervene a little bit if needed to summarize. And at that point, we'll probably be just at the time to take a few questions from the audience. So I managed to not impale myself on the mic stand.
Okay, so I'm Hin-Yan from the University of Copenhagen. Originally, I was meant to have a talk, but it was better better with response. Yeah, exactly, precisely. And so I think that like what I'm focused on a lot is like Jeroen's comment that the future is is like sort of perceived somehow to be or seem to be somehow like today. And I wanted to bring some like sort of technological regulation into this. And so that got me thinking about the Coleridge dilemma. So I don't know if you've come across this. It's David Coleridge's dilemma from 1980s. It's about the social control of technology. And he posits an information problem and a power problem. So before technology is widely introduced, we don't know what the effects are of this whole uncertainty thing that we've been talking about, so on and so forth, but it's easy and cheap to change. But at some point, once technologies become properly ingrained and diffused through society, we get a power problem. So the power problem then is that we know what the problems are, they become very, very obvious, but it becomes very difficult and costly to change. That's very obvious, but it's one way of sort of framing it, call it the Coleridge dilemma. We have a label, we can discuss it all of a sudden. And so then that ties to another observation that Jeroen makes about this kind of perceived inevitability. Because the thing is, okay, so originally David Coleridge suggested that, well, we should leave things on the power problem side of things a bit loose so that we can change it. That was kind of because we don't have a crystal ball and we can't solve the information problem. So leave open the power problem. But it seems that if we're lurching towards this inevitability, we seem to somehow get locked into that, which to me seems to be a massive problem. And I guess it wasn't part of your discussion at the beginning, but just before this panel, we were talking about how, like, once you get a system up and running, we have to keep it running. And I hope that I'm wrong in making this comment or making this assumption. But it seems like a lot of the governance talk arches through research and sort of hits deployment. But I don't know how much thinking there has been about this sort of perception of like perpetuation and maintenance. And I wanted to throw in a couple of observations at this point, because I'm not too sure that we've been really talking about this sort of governance and regulation of this kind of longer term thing. And so it seems firstly that I don't know how this dynamic plays out. It's more like a sort of provocation. So the idea of normal accidents, which was raised also in an earlier panel, right? So if you have an interactional complex system that's tightly coupled and prone to catastrophic collapse, it's very, very difficult to avoid, hence normal accidents. The suggestion of the normal accidents is simply to sort of step back from the technology. But again, given these dynamics pushing us towards SRM, it seems that we get locked into this position where we may rely on something that will normally fail for our very survival. So these were some of the things that came up. I'll leave it at that for now.
So I think just expanding the provocation to not only do you need to think about security, the implicit steering of the way that knowledge is framed in the lead up into a world in which we may or may not make insertion to SRM, but that only leads it into a whole new set of the same kinds of questions, adding to the steering requirements. I'm sure there's even more to add.
Okay, so wow, this is Jessica asked me in an email very politely to join the panel. I was like, yeah, sure. So everyone on this panel so far has been like in the kind of originating provocations, and I'm somehow, I guess, responding to provocations. Okay, super interesting. And Olaf, I think your reframing was incredibly interesting, and I think something that has been said, but I don't know if this community takes seriously enough. Sometimes it's said kind of rhetorically and kind of totemically that we need more perspectives, more people, more disciplines, and I don't think that's really absorbed. And I think your paper, and that, especially that final table, really illustrates perfectly how people are seeing things completely differently from a different vantage point. And I think this community maybe overrepresents certain vantage points over others, physics, whatever, and, which is interesting work, but okay, so that was really helpful. But I think the big takeaway from listening to you, which then I fed into how I kind of absorbed. So is it Jeroen? Jeroen. Okay, I'm really sorry, Jeroen. Into Jeroen's work is, I just felt like what the punchline from your talk is that SRM and geoengineering just overcomplicates climate action, and so the idea that it presents a neat solution is just that didn't really land with me. That somehow that the idea that this can be a neat kind of techno-optimistic solution, when I put it in the context of this, socio-political mess. So I don't know. I'd love to see what you two think about that. I think it was very instructive, the CDR comparison, Jeroen, that you shared. Also, I do think sometimes, I think that trajectory that you mapped out is very clear and illustrates exactly your point about. I love this kind of normalization, calibration, inevitability, narrative, dramatization, creation of basically creating a whole space and making it the norm. All that is interesting, but then part of me also thinks that CDR is just still in the middle of a hype cycle. Like, what is real? Is the perception of its dominance and entrenchedness, is that all part of this kind of drama and production and theater, and we'll move on to the next? And I was just talking to a few people recently. I've kind of lived through quite a number of hype cycles. I did my PhD in nanotechnology in the middle of a nanotechnology hype cycle. And so these kind of come and go. So I just would love to hear what you think about that. I thought also, I wonder if you could say, if you thought, Jeroen, and actually both of you, this has implications for both, just to take an example from outside the climate space. So I've been thinking a lot about AI and how the norms have shifted rapidly. Like a couple years ago, the AI people were companies were calling for a moratorium, and that has kind of shifted very quickly. I just wonder what parallels you see, and what forces were driving those huge paradigmatic shifts in that space. And I don't know if that has anything that we can learn from or reflect on, or I don't know. So okay, so I'll stop there. Hopefully minimal provocation. I'd love to hear what you think.
Thanks very much for the questions. Yeah. How does it provide a neat solution when it's such a total mess, is your question, basically. Well, I hope that my aim is kind of to make sure we're not underestimating the complexity and the messiness of it. And my worry is that some of the tools used to explore it, which are useful tools, I'm not saying they're not, but they have a simplification in them, in that they don't take many dimensions of the world into account. And so when they're used to say it can be done, it's feasible, I want to stop there and say, what's your notion of feasibility? I mean, yeah, we know from volcanoes that it kind of cools the planet, but what is embodied or hidden in that claim of feasibility or plausibility? Or if you say, my model doesn't have to be accurate, but it has to have threshold of plausibility. What are you including in that threshold? How are you producing that threshold? And I think the fundamental fact of the international or intersocietal complicates that matter enormously. And probably all kinds of other, sociology also complicates it, and political science. But that's what I'm hoping, that it does look very neat if you squint at a climate model maybe, or in some packaging of it, in some presentations of it, especially if it's always the science leading first, or sometimes on its own. So that's the aim. Maybe, shall I let someone else answer my question and then come back to some of the other questions? Or shall I drone on? Okay, a couple of more sections. What parallels with AI? I think I felt when that conference fell apart recently, the AI governance conference, and the major powers came out and basically said, we're not doing it. These are too sensitive. This is core national security stuff. I just thought, years and years, I've been affiliated with the Center for Existential Risk in Cambridge, years and years and years of talking about governance of AI. And similarly in this space, talking about governance, like there's a governance imaginary. I mean, we talk about a technological one, but there's a governance imaginary here which is sort of hovering above us. We haven't even mentioned the state of the geopolitical world that it's the twist that it's taken recently at this conference. I haven't really heard it, at least. So I think there's a lot of similarities. That said, I don't think SRM is as geopolitically potent as AI is. So I do think it has a geopolitical strategic potential, and security actors will see it as having that. But if you have a technology where there are game changers, it's very hard to overcome that with governance and coordinated, international, institutionalized, and in any way kind of democratic, forget it kind of thing. So yeah, I see some similarities, but also maybe not.
One thing on the AI, I mean, one of the reasons that I brought up that point in the beginning about what I think Jeroen stated more succinctly, that the absence of governance, or the default is not the absence. And I think if you look at the early days of AI, the 60s, 70s, sort of where things could have gone at that point if there had been explicit steering as opposed to de facto anticipation by very small and particular interests, we could be in a very different AI setting. And in some ways, that might be the way to think about where we are now, perhaps. Anyway, back to you, Jeroen. Sorry, I'm using my moderators.
No, I think it was very useful. Yeah, these were very big provocations, and so I'm going to classify them in two categories, how I've sort of classified them in my mind. One is the question about hype, and one is what I phrased as yes, but also. But let me start with hype, right? And taking that question, fair point about SRM is not something that we can do neatly. It is way too complex. What we're talking about, or what I would be talking about, is specifically the creation of hype, not even deliberate creation of hype, around SRM that creates the impression that it will be a neat solution to the problem. Right? And we've already seen that. Me following European climate activism quite closely, for example, that people seem to think that the world will end if we don't meet 1.5, right? Like that has become such a hard deadline for catastrophe. And these are the similar kind of cultural dynamics that will run away with SRM, right? So, and I agree with you fundamentally, CDR is nothing but hype to me. To me, the feature it has in climate politics is basically functioning as a lie. But so that doesn't mean that it isn't normalized as something that politicians, for example, use as, let's say, we're going for net zero instead of zero. Or we're going, so it becomes a sort of what we would call a discursive carrier of all kinds of meanings and all kinds of promises about the future. So that's sort of my concern around SRM specifically. And in that sense, the looking into analogous developments, I am all for. But I've had pushback in this community for even using the CDR analogy as something that would worry us. So I was like, okay, I'll not push it too far, but I think Gentech is one of the things that we should definitely look at as analogies. Like, there's so many, even nuclear proliferation has a sort of things that we can learn from. Now, I think the key thing also, to go back to Hin-Yan, your point about stability over time, which I classified in the yes but also thing. Right? Like, a lot of times when I'm in spaces like this, people seem to misunderstand that what I'm trying to say is that they're wrong. Where I'm trying to say, yes, what you're saying is true, but also let's think about this. So that's basically how I would also see Olaf's contribution. Right? Like, yes, this is a climate technology, but also it's something else. And I think one of the points that we're trying to make in this book about environmental politics is, yes, it is motivated by concern about the future of the environment, but also it was a way to take environmental politics off the streets, where it was volatile and dangerous to power distributions, and into neatly organized governance systems. Right? And I think one of the key features of governance, to me, is always that it is about getting desirable outcomes, but it is also about stability creation. And that is what governance, by and large, is for, because that's also what the people who have the means and power to make governance want, right? Because they want to stabilize their means and power. And one of the features of that, I think, sort of deeply rooted features, is that we tend to think that this remarkable sort of stability of a lot of the systems globally over the past, say, 30 or so years will be carried on into the future. And whether this is about saying we can do SRM for the next 100 years, or all our pension systems assume the same rate of return for the next 100 years. The Dutch government only recently decided not to wait for 100 years on making a decision about what to do with the permanent storage of nuclear waste. Right? So all of these assumptions that we can postpone these things because our systems will be stable towards the future. And that's embedded into the knowledge systems and the knowledge that we create. I think I would also say that that is what we see in a lot of the modeling exercises in this community. And then finally, sort of where it comes together is building on what Olaf says, to do SRM and to have this kind of technology. There's a really famous quote by James Scott, a political scientist, that I think we should all have in the forefront of our minds. Certain forms of governing and certain forms of knowledge require the creation of a synoptic view of reality. And you need to cut out everything that is inconvenient, because that's not what you're governing, that's not what you're intervening in. And yes, we need to do that, because that is what governing is. But the consequence of that is that everything else is cut out, right? So if you reduce the whole system to 2 levers, you're cutting out so much else. This is why the yes but also is really important. And it's also why the hype is so easy to create, because if you're just steering on those 2 levers, you might insinuate success even if you're failing tremendously.
I'm really glad that was seeing like a statement. Yes. Yeah. So I'm glad that Jeroen brought seeing like a statement, because it's one of those points that also hits at the interface between research and application of that research. Is that research in terms of being able to recognize multiple perspectives and larger numbers of dimensions and greater complexity as it moves into anything like operationalization is a
Yeah, thanks a lot. My question would be regarding what could be the lessons we draw from this decade-long span of research on consequences of technology. In Central Europe, there has been a lot, for example, in the nuclear technology discussion. Could this strand of experience be helpful in the context of how we deal with SRM?
Does anyone have a two-finger, like a, I don't know, economists do this two-finger thing. Anyone have an immediately related extra clause that you want to add to Axel's point? All right, now, so, yeah. Why don't we, instead of trying to cram things together, if you have thoughts on this, Mark, I know Bruce, you probably have thoughts on this.
I'm not familiar with exactly what you're talking about, but maybe others are.
Rich tradition of predicting consequences of new technologies and dealing with them in national governance. At least in Germany, there has been a multi-decadal process. I think one could take this also as an analogy how to deal with technologies such as SRM, but it has never been mentioned, not here in this session, neither in other sessions. I think it's very relevant.
Sure. I don't know if this is directly relevant, but the first response that comes to mind is like the sci-fi speculative fiction kind of adage. If you invent the car, you should also invent the traffic jam, the car crash, all the rest of it. And so part of me thinks that that the information problem is impossible, but also it's just like I don't think that adage goes far enough, because it's like, okay, fine, you could envisage all of those things, but you don't envisage urban sprawl, obesity, mechanized warfare, like all of these things that come from the internal combustion engine. So I think that if you focus on the technology, you're never ever going to be able to unfold the societal consequences or anything like this. A different way of putting this would also be that if you look through speculative fiction, right, notably the PC is absent from most of the literature, right, even though it's been massive in terms of our daily lives. I would also say, bridging on the AI discussion, if I could, that like there's a lot of work on AI governance because we have a rich cultural imagery, but quantum computing, for example, has no imagery and therefore very little sort of governance regulation kind of work. So it may also have to do with the imageries underlying too. I don't know how that plays out with SR.
I think I know what you mean, but for me, there's a category shift from a domestic context and the sort of internalist assumptions that we imagine society in the singular. I think there's a lot of regulation of technology inside societies. I find it much more challenging to think about it, powerful technologies being successfully governed in a multiple societal context.
Okay, I'll say two things that I hope are related to anything. But so one, actually, Jessica, what you asked, you had a comment about, oh, what if we governed AI like in the beginning? And I think one thing is at the time it was just a speculative thing that was never going to happen. And actually, I have a little bit of cognitive dissonance in this space because like most of my brain is like, this will never happen. And so I struggle to actually engage with governance because I'm kind of like in the mindset of people who are like thinking about AI decades ago when it wasn't a thing. And so I don't know how it's kind of early days. I think there's a temporal dimension here that I don't know how we bypass it, even if we might know from history that we should be trying to put things in place. But I think also it's difficult to control and determine the pathway this early. I think about nuclear too, but maybe, I don't know, again, in a slightly different way. But, just the cycle that we're in now with nuclear, like in the US, I mean, who could have foretold it's now peak? We're at peak nuclear, and nuclear is hot, like super hot, like everything has been is being removed from the energy agenda, zero carbon agenda, and nuclear is at the top. And so I think that there's this technology is not the only dimension. There's so many axes, and the political windows that open and close around what kind of enters the zeitgeist, it's very complex, and it's very hard to predict, and it's not like an orderly process. And something crazy can happen on the technological front that brings to the fore certain like political, government, whatever discussions. I think that happened with AI. Like something happened on the technology front that just kind of now this is a thing that is real and complicated, and we're kind of scrambling. And then on the other side, like with nuclear, actually the window opened in the nanotechnology front. There was a bit of like advances on the like advanced nuclear, but I think really like nuclear has been pushed into the forefront by nanotechnology factors primarily. So I think it's like a really complicated dance.
So basically, yes, we can look for other areas, but in a limited with humility, don't as such predictability. Ben, and then in the preface for the last two questions.
Yeah, so I want to preface this by saying I apologize for my question being dour. I'm a climate scientist reading something in the bad mood for 6 minutes. So I was struck by the analogy to AI, because the AI can do amazing things, like it can detect cancer, for example. But I also remember waking up one day and my basically said, hey, you have Apple Intelligence in it. And it's awful and a waste of power and time and ridiculous amounts of money. And I just feel like these sorts of things have been crammed down my throat. And there's no recourse. Like there's just a bunch of disenfranchisements. And so paralleling this with SRM, I mean, I'm happy as a climate modeler to take lessons on how to communicate better and how to better provide a holistic picture of reality. I want to get a sense what you think of how much this conversation in this room actually matters.
Maybe we should just go to the one right now. We're at 3 minutes away. We're at 3 minutes away from the end, so we'll take Mark's question as well, because Ben's question was a weighty one.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to have to apologize for my question as well, because it's probably would suggest to you I haven't listened to a word you said, but I've got the unenviable, I obviously have, it's been a fantastic discussion, but I've got the unenviable task of tying this down to like a 75-word summary. And I just wondered if there's a chance that you could pithily summarize the key point you would like people to take away from what you're saying today. One line, because...
So that what we say here gets out and has a shot at mattering. Give Mark your short version. I have notes.
I will work my way towards that, because that's actually the harder one. No, because I think my answer to you is both yes and no. There was something I was saving for my session on non-use tomorrow, but it just ties on very neatly on what you're saying. So I think we all need to recognize that maybe very soon we might look back somewhat wistfully at that taboo on SRM, right? That it has been taken completely out of our control and shoved down our throats the exact way that AI does. So in that sense, does it really matter? Maybe not, right? Like if people run with it, they run with it. But then when you look at the way that, for example, climate science, early climate science, that was deeply influenced by military funding, still sort of sets the tone of the debate politically and sets sort of the boundaries, what we talk around, it matters tremendously. So the kind of knowledge base that you're building now might set sort of the scene for the next 50 years of talking about this. And if you boil it down already to very simple levers that are easy to grab hold of, then it becomes A, much easier for, let's call them the AI folks, to run away with it. And B, you're creating a sort of mold. Like, the absence of governance doesn't mean that isn't there, right? Like a mold that you cannot get out of. And actually, you can use that as my summary.
Yeah, I also was sitting here thinking, I think when or if this moves from the lab to to the skies, we won't have very much power over it. So, but then maybe there is some path dependency that we can think about here. And I'm still, in some ways, interested in the possibility of establishing international research collaborations that can try and circumvent some of the geopolitical logics that I think are waiting in the wings, if not already active. My summary would be something along the lines that the origins and the dominant epistemologies of SRM are excluding a whole range of dimensions and potential risks, potentially also benefits, who knows, but I'm focusing on the risks. And one of them is that we always assume it will be driven by climate logics, and there are other logics that will kick in, if not already doing so.
It doesn't matter what we're saying. So I think it's mattered a great deal for me, actually, this conversation. I've learned a lot. I don't know. I think right now we're kind of in a learning mode. I don't think this community is okay, anything can happen, and there's a lot that is unpredictable. But I think that we're not in prime time. We're in learning, sharing, talking to each other, and so out there. I think it's. At this point, my sense is it's less important what happens outside of this room. I think it's what we take and put into our work and our thinking and how we build the field. So I think I found it very, very useful. Just a quick thing when I was thinking about like a thing that definitely AI, CDR have in common is money, actually. And so I think for right now there isn't a lot of moneyed interest. There isn't a lot of money to be made here. So I think that also kind of gives us the cover of quiet for now, but that could change. So definitely, I think people are shoving AI down your throat because the companies are desperate to make their trillions and to make a business case. And in CDR, there's a lot of big money floating around. And I don't say it in obviously these could be useful things, but I think that money really changes the equation, and I don't know to what. I think right now we're not quite there, but I think that's a question that will need to be asked a bit more down the road. My summary is Jessica owes me a beer. And this is not, I think this session has put such a fine point to it. And I love the language that you guys use. I really want to sit with it. A bit. I've been writing down, I think when you said discussive curry of meaning, I love that language, and this is not language that science and policy people are using. So all this to say, I think we lose a lot when we center the very scientific, technical framing and imagination and language in this field.
So for me, I don't know what doesn't matter means. So I don't really know how to respond to that. Sorry. But I think that in terms of a summary for me, it seems that technologies, we think we regulate them, but ultimately they seem to regulate us in the sense that it changes the scope of affordances and our sphere of control and capability. I don't think that SRM is anything is different in that sense. It will change what we can do and what we cannot do in very concrete ways. And so I think that rather than thinking whether we can control the technology, it's how we can resist the technology controlling us. And one kind of spin on this is sort of like axiological, sort of human values sort of shifts that are often accelerated by technology, right? And we see this with digital technologies that I think prior we were worried about surveillance, and then it seems like, well, actually convenience seems to be our value rather than resisting surveillance. And so when it comes to risk and things like this with SRM, maybe actually if this technology sort of takes off, or even the discourse takes off, we will then learn that we accept a lot more risk than we previously knew we did, something like this. So I think that there will be this value axiological shift that we should be prepared to think about too. That's my summary.
Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience for coming and for being history is often these things are unpredictable and incredibly influential, and it's not easy to not be naive, but it's important to at least try, and to try to live sort of consciously and adaptively and seeking out new perspectives, framings, possibilities. And to the extent that this community can do that, I think we're in a much better place than even just a few years ago. And the world would be in a better place if that sense of questioning and different forms of critique remains embedded. That's the bet. So we'll see.
Can I just, as the final word, say what the subtitle of Seeing Like a State is? How certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed.
James Scott unfortunately passed away, and the book was written before much of the internet, but it has a lot of lessons, actually, I would say.